Welcome to A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose, a worldwide web event.
I want to look at some of the email questions, there's a question from Grace in Pleasanton, California, that says, since I've been an owner of a dog, I find myself so much more in the present. My question is, why am I naturally so much more present with an animal than I'm sometimes dealing with people?
Ah, yes. Well, the animal does not provoke thought activity because the dog is not thinking. When the dog looks at you, the dog is not thinking what kind of a person you are. The dog is not judging you. The dog is at a state of consciousness prior to the arrival of thought. So the dog is, and that state has certain similarities with the state of presence, which is a state of going beyond thinking, where we are going. In both cases, if you are...
So in that way, the dogs are a little more enlightened than we are?
In some ways, the dogs are more connected with being, than we are, than normal humans are.
Normal humans are.
And so...
Because that's where they are all the time.
Yes, and I sometimes call them dogs and cats particularly because that's the pets that for millions of humans are very important in their lives.
Right.
I call them guardians of being.
Guardians of being.
Because for many people, they fulfill that function. For many people who are so lost in their minds, so much involved in their thought processes, the only moments they have when they are not trapped in that is when they're relating to their animal, their pet.
All right. I have to get to this quote. Oh, well, I'll get to that in a moment. You say that the role of the parent should not be to spare children from all suffering. Why not?
Because, first of all, you can't. It would be futile to even attempt. Of course, you protect the child as much as you can. But every human being has to go through a certain amount of suffering. You cannot come into this planet and avoid suffering.
Because that's what being a human being is.
Yes.
That there's some discord.
Yes.
Yes.
And that is how we grow. If there were a human being that could have avoided all suffering, that human being would be totally superficial and totally identified with the external form of things, because it's suffering that drives you deeper, drives you within, where you need to find...
And by suffering, do you mean not getting what we want?
Well, that's one form of suffering, too. There are different forms of suffering. Many forms of suffering, of course, are generated by the ego itself. These are ultimately unnecessary forms of suffering.
Right.
But they are necessary for as long as you are unconscious.
And another word for suffering would be challenges or difficulties, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Challenges...
so you can't be a human being without being challenged?
No. That would be... you would miss the whole purpose for being here.
Okay.
So you need to see, even your children will not escape. They will, sooner or later, and usually sooner than later, they will encounter their form of suffering, whatever it is. You protect them as much as you can, but when you see certain things are inevitable, they may do things, unconscious behavior, they may generate their own suffering, self-generated, or it may happen to them from the outside. But no matter what, it will happen. And then, rather than going into intense anguish, see, this is human suffering. And every human, you had to go through your forms of suffering. In my case, for example, my parents had very heavy pain bodies. There was constant conflict at home. And that was my constant suffering.
Pain body, that's next week.
Yes.
Yes.
We'll talk about that.
Okay. No, finish the sentence. I just wanted to say
this, of course, not only applies to children, it also applies to other people that may be close to you and going through their suffering. You do what you can to help them, whatever you can. The important thing is that you don't go into anguish yourself, because by going into anxiety and anguish yourself, you're not helping them at all.
Okay.
Because whatever state you are in transmits itself to others.
How does playing a role at work keep us from being powerful?
Well, if you play a role at work, you always have a secondary motive in what you do, because the ego is at work. You are not totally focused on the task at hand, because there is some self-interest there. You want to protect yourself, you want to get credit for yourself, you want to perhaps eliminate other people around you, or perhaps you want to use other people for your own purposes.
A lot of times this happens when people get promoted to supervisors.
Yes.
You know, they were really good in whatever position they had, and then they get promoted to supervisors, have a little more power, means
Yes.
they're not just now functioning at work for themselves, but now they're over other people. And a little bit of power goes to their heads, and before you know it,
That's absolutely
trouble.
right. And that's the ego. If you have a position of little power, then the ego is kind of there in potential. It's there, it's latent as far as your work situation is concerned.
Right.
The similar situation you have in certain third world countries, where often you find a revolution overthrows the government, and the people who initiate the revolution have the best intentions. They want to do away with corruption. They want the best for their country. The moment they get into power, the latent ego in them, although they had good intentions, comes up and they repeat the same dysfunction that they wanted to do away with.
happens all the time.
Yes.
All right. Shali lives in Stockholm. Shali, you were on earlier today. We Skyped on the Oprah Winfrey show earlier. Well, you've been up a long time. I hear you have a question about raising your 3-year-old daughter. Go ahead.
I do have a question about that. A lot of it, I guess, has been answered just by listening to tonight's show. But the question about her is, how do you stay present when you're trying to discipline your child and she starts screaming and shouting? And she's only 3, so I can't really explain to her that it's really your ego that's coming out. And I feel like she's learning these roles. I guess my question is, you know, I want to raise her as a more conscious human being. You know, I don't want her to be awakened at the age of 35 like me. So how do you raise a more conscious child? And how do you stay more conscious when you're dealing with conflict? Because I don't want to set a negative pattern for, you know, when she's 16 and she wants to borrow the car, for example.
Yes, yes. I would suggest that you first of all, pay more attention to your inner state than to what is happening to your daughter. Because I believe you experience perhaps your daughter causing you feelings of anxiety sometimes.
Yeah, right on.
You believe
Absolutely.
that? Now, that seems to be the case, that your daughter, by going through certain kinds of behavior, causes you feelings of anxiety, but ultimately that is not the case. You cause yourself the feelings of anxiety. When your daughter refuses to eat, she's not making you anxious. Only you can do that. So it is vital what state of consciousness you are in, what emotional state you are in when you are relating to your daughter. Because if you're often in a state of anxiety, you get into a vicious circle. The anxiety that you believe was caused by your daughter's behavior, but is ultimately caused by your reaction to your daughter's behavior, that anxiety then will affect her. And that is a nervous energy field that will provoke further so-called bad behavior in her, because children absorb.
I was going to say, a 3-year-old is absorbing that and picking up that energy more than even your language.
Yes.
They're picking up the energy that you carry.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.